Imagine booking a weekend getaway in the middle of the woods. No neighbors, no noise, just an old house by a creek where you and your friends can relax. Sounds perfect, right? That's what four friends thought when they drove out to Hollow Creek. But what they didn't know was that the house wasn't waiting to welcome them. It was waiting to feed. At first it was little things, strange whispers, footsteps on the porch, a figure in the window. But by the time they realized the truth, it was already too late. This is the story of the house that doesn't let anyone leave. Alive, the road to Hollow Creek stretched on like an endless ribbon of cracked asphalt, winding through trees that seemed too tall, too heavy, as though they leaned closer the deeper you drove. Daniel kept his hands tight on the wheel, his phone's GPS flickering between service and dead zones. In the back seat, Melissa scrolled aimlessly, while Chris cracked jokes to keep the mood light. Sarah, sitting in the passenger seat, stared out the window, her eyes fixed on the darkening woods. The four of them had planned this trip for months. A quiet weekend away from the noise of the city, someplace where the air didn't taste of smoke and concrete. The old rental house had looked perfect in the online listing. Cheap, remote, rustic, with a wide porch and a view of the creek. The owner had barely asked any questions, just sent the key code and wished them luck. By the time the sun dipped low, their car pulled onto a narrow dirt road. The house appeared suddenly, rising out of the trees like something forgotten. Its paint was peeling, the shutters tilted, and the porch sagged like tired shoulders. For a moment, nobody said anything. "This place looks like a horror movie set," Chris finally said, grinning. "That's because it is," Sarah muttered, her voice flat. Melissa laughed nervously. "Come on, it's just old. We'll make it cozy." Inside, the air was thick and cold, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and smoke. The wooden floors groaned under their steps. In the living room, a stone fireplace dominated the wall, its blackened mouth filled with ashes. On the mantel sat a row of photographs in frames so dusty the glass had turned opaque. Daniel reached out, wiping one clean with his sleeve. The picture showed a family standing in front of the same house decades earlier. Their faces were stiff, unsmiling, eyes sharp even through faded colors. Behind them, the trees looked the same as they did now. Unchanged by time. "Creepy," Daniel said, putting the frame back. That night, after unpacking and lighting a few candles, the house's power kept flickering. They settled around the fireplace. The fire crackled, casting long shadows on the walls. Chris told a ghost story, his voice rising and falling theatrically, while Melissa sipped wine and tried not to jump. It was almost midnight when Sarah spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you hear that?" Everyone froze. Outside, past the laughter of the firewood, there was a sound, faint at first, then clearer. The crunch of footsteps moving slowly across the porch. Daniel stood, heart pounding. He grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the front door. The beam of light revealed nothing but dust and the warped wood of the doorframe. He opened the door and stepped outside. The porch was empty. The night was silent. The trees loomed, their branches swaying like arms in the wind. But when he turned back toward the house, his stomach dropped. There in the window behind the others stood a figure, and it wasn't one of his friends. Daniel froze on the porch, the flashlight beam quivering in his hand. His breath clouded in the chill night air as he stared through the glass. The figure in the window wasn't moving. It was just standing there, pale and still, its outline blurred by the reflection of the firelight inside. "Daniel?" Melissa's voice trembled from inside the house. "What are you looking at?" He blinked and the figure was gone. Just like that. The window showed only his three friends, wide-eyed and waiting for him to say something. He forced a laugh, though his throat was dry. "Nothing. Just my imagination." He stepped back in, locking the door behind him. The others didn't push for details, but the unease clung to them like damp air. Chris tried to lighten the mood again, tossing another log onto the fire, but even he kept glancing at the window. By 1 in the morning, they all decided to turn in. The house had 4 bedrooms upstairs, each with mismatched furniture that looked older than any of them. Sarah picked the room at the end of the hall. Melissa and Chris took the adjoining rooms, and Daniel chose the one facing the creek. As he lay in bed, the house spoke around him, groans of wood settling, the faint rattle of loose glass panes. He told himself it was just an old structure breathing, Nothing more. But then came another sound. Not the house, not the wind. A whisper. It drifted from the hallway, soft, broken, like someone speaking through water. Daniel sat up, his chest tight. He opened the door, peering into the darkness of the hall. The whisper cut off, leaving silence so heavy it pressed against his ears. "Hello?" he whispered back, though he hated himself for it. No answer, only the faint scrape of something dragging against the floorboards. In Sarah's room, the sound woke her too. She sat up, clutching her blanket, her eyes darting to the corner where the shadows seemed thicker. For a moment she thought she saw movement. A hand, pale and long-fingered, curling back into the dark like it had been caught watching. She shut her eyes tight, praying it was a trick of the firelight leaking through the cracks. Melissa dreamed of water that night. She was waist-deep in the creek behind the house, the current pulling hard, her legs numb from the cold. Figures stood on the bank, their faces blurred, their voices rising in low chants. She tried to scream, but when she opened her mouth, water poured in. She woke with a gasp, heart racing, her sheets damp with sweat. By dawn, no one felt rested. Over breakfast, they compared stories. Daniel admitted he thought he'd heard whispers. Melissa described her dream, and Sarah simply said, "This place isn't right." Chris, though pale, tried to laugh it off. "Come on, guys. It's an old house. Weird dreams, creaks in the floor. It's just our brains filling in blanks. We wanted scary, didn't we?" But when Daniel glanced at the window, his stomach twisted again. Because in the early morning light, clear as day, he could see footprints on the porch, and they led straight to the door. The day stretched out grey and heavy, the sky hanging low with clouds that seemed to press against the treetops. After breakfast, they decided to explore the area, if only to shake off the night's tension. Melissa insisted fresh air would clear their heads. The path behind the house sloped downward through the woods, leading toward the creek. The further they walked, the quieter everything became. No birds, no rustle of small animals, only the sound of their own footsteps. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. When they reached the water, the creek looked nothing like Melissa's dream. It was shallow, slow-moving, with mossy stones breaking the surface. Yet the water was unnaturally dark, reflecting the trees like a sheet of black glass. "Not exactly swimming material," Chris joked, tossing a pebble into the current. The ripple spread outward, but instead of fading, it seemed to travel farther and farther until it disappeared around a bend. Sarah crouched near the bank, her hand hovering above the surface. "It feels wrong," she said quietly, "like it doesn't want us here." Daniel scanned the opposite bank. Something caught his eye, a circle of stones arranged carefully on the shore. In the center lay bones, small and brittle, as though some animal had been sacrificed there. Guys," he said, pointing. They crossed carefully, the stones slick underfoot. Up close, the circle looked deliberate, the bones arranged in a pattern. A thin rope, frayed and weathered, was tied around one of the stones like a marker. Melissa's voice trembled. "This is ritual stuff, isn't it? Like witchcraft or something?" Chris forced a laugh, though his face had gone pale. Or just some local kids being edgy. But Daniel wasn't convinced. He bent closer and noticed carvings on one of the larger stones. Not words, symbols, jagged lines that spiraled inward, crude but purposeful. The air grew colder. A sudden gust swept through the trees, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke. Sarah gasped and pointed back toward the house. A figure was standing on the porch. From the distance they could barely make it out, but the outline was unmistakable. Tall, thin, unmoving. As soon as Daniel blinked, it was gone. They hurried back, unease growing with every step. But when they reached the house, the porch was empty. No footprints this time, no sign of anyone there. Only the front door stood slightly ajar. "I locked that," Daniel said, his voice sharp. Inside, the air was colder than before. The photographs on the mantel were scattered on the floor, frames cracked, glass shattered. Each picture now faced downward, as if someone or something had placed them that way on purpose. Melissa whispered, "What if we're not alone here?" Sarah's answer was immediate, her tone steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We aren't." For the rest of the afternoon, no one suggested leaving the house. But none of them could ignore what had happened by the creek, the ritual stones, the bones, the symbols, and as night began to fall again, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the thing watching them wasn't in the woods anymore. It was inside. By the time the second night settled over Hollow Creek, the house felt different. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier, as though the building itself were alive and waiting. They lit every candle they could find, but the shadows still pressed in, clinging to corners like oil stains. Chris tried to keep spirits up, flipping through his phone for music, but there was no signal. Just static bursts whenever he pressed play. Melissa sat near the fireplace, hugging her knees, her eyes darting to the window every few seconds. Sarah didn't speak at all. She just stared into the flames like she was trying to read something in them. Daniel paced. The door still unsettled him. He knew he had locked it, yet it had opened. And the photographs, he kept replaying the image of them face down, like the house itself had rejected its memories. Around midnight, the whispering returned. This time louder, more distinct. Words, though none of them made sense. The sound slithered through the floorboards as if a voice were rising from beneath the house. Melissa covered her ears. "Make it stop," she begged. Daniel grabbed the flashlight and gestured for Chris to follow. They searched the basement door, which had been locked when they arrived. Now it hung slightly open. A smell drifted up, damp earth mixed with something coppery, metallic. Chris swallowed hard. Nope, I'm not going down there." But Daniel stepped onto the stairs. The beam of his flashlight cut through the dark, illuminating stone walls, slick with moisture. The floor was dirt, uneven and freshly disturbed in places. At the far end, half buried in the earth, was a wooden box. He approached slowly, every nerve screaming at him to turn back. The box wasn't large, maybe the size of a suitcase. Symbols had been carved into its lid, the same jagged spirals from the creek stones. Suddenly, something moved inside, a scratching sound. A dull thump. Daniel stumbled back, his breath ragged. Chris bolted, slamming the basement door shut. They dragged a chair in front of it, their hands shaking, but the scratching didn't stop. It grew louder, more frantic, as though whatever was inside the box had woken up. Upstairs, Sarah finally spoke. Her voice was calm, almost detached. "They buried it here. They didn't want it to leave." Everyone stared at her. Melissa's lips trembled. "What are you talking about?" Sarah looked toward the ceiling, her eyes glassy. "This house isn't a home. It's a cage, and we're locked inside with it." As if to answer her, the lights flickered violently. Every candle guttered, the shadows stretching unnaturally long across the walls. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through the floor, and then came the knock. 3 sharp raps on the front door. Daniel's stomach dropped. Slowly, against every instinct, he turned his head. Through the glass panel, a face peered in. But it wasn't human. The face at the door was stretched and wrong, its features blurred like melted wax, yet its eyes were sharp, black pits that seemed to pull the firelight into them. Melissa screamed, stumbling backward. Chris grabbed a poker from the fireplace, holding it out with trembling hands. The knocking returned, harder this time. Each strike rattled the walls, shaking dust from the ceiling. Daniel bolted forward, ready to lock the door tighter, but before he reached it, the wood splintered. The door burst open as if struck by an invisible force. Cold air swept in, extinguishing every flame. Darkness swallowed the house. The only sound was breathing, not theirs, but something heavier, closer, moving through the room with them. Daniel swung the flashlight on, the beam slicing across the floor. For a split second, the light caught something tall and pale standing in the corner. Then it flickered out, upstairs. Sarah shouted, breaking the paralysis. They bolted for the staircase, footsteps pounding. Behind them, the thing moved, its steps slow, deliberate, dragging across the wooden floor. They barricaded themselves in Sarah's room, shoving a dresser against the door. Melissa sobbed into her hands, Chris muttered curses under his breath, and Daniel tried to get the flashlight working again. Sarah sat cross-legged on the floor, her expression eerily calm. "It won't stop," she said softly. "It's been here too long, fed too long," Daniel snapped at her. "What do you mean, fed?" Her eyes met his. "The dreams, the whispers, it's feeding on us already." That's what it does. It lures people here. That's why the owner never asked questions. A crash shook the door, wood splintering. The pale hand reached through the gap, its fingers impossibly long, curling like claws. Chris swung the poker, smashing the hand. The creature shrieked, a sound that wasn't human, high and guttural, rattling their bones. The floorboards beneath them groaned, cracking. Daniel realized too late what was happening. The house itself was giving way. With a violent snap, the floor collapsed, dropping them into the basement. They landed hard, dust and earth filling their lungs. The flashlight flickered back to life, its beam settling on the box at the far end. The lid was open now, empty. A shadow rose from the box, twisting upward, forming a shape that was almost human but stretched, distorted. The air grew unbearably cold. "It's free," Sarah whispered. Daniel grabbed Melissa, pulling her toward the stairs, but the exit was gone, swallowed by darkness. Chris swung wildly with the poker, but the shadow engulfed him, dragging him down until his screams cut off. Melissa's hand slipped from Daniel's grip, her face pale as the shadow wrapped around her too. Her eyes met his one last time before she vanished into the dark. Only Daniel and Sarah remained. He turned to her, desperate, but her expression was blank. "You don't fight it," she said quietly. "You join it." And as the shadow surged forward, swallowing the last of the light, Daniel realized Sarah's eyes were no longer her own. They were black, endless pits, just like the face at the door. The house at Hollow Creek had claimed them all, and by morning it stood silent again, waiting for the next set of footsteps on the porch. By morning, the house at Hollow Creek looked empty again, quiet, still. The kind of silence that tricks you into thinking nothing ever happened there. But if you stand on the porch long enough, you'll notice the floorboards creak under invisible weight. And if you look through the windows, sometimes just for a second, you'll see faces staring back. Not the family who rented it last, not the ones before them, but the ones the house has kept. Some say the property is still listed online, cheap, always available, always waiting for the next group who thinks a weekend in the woods sounds like fun. And maybe right now someone's already booked their stay. The house doesn't need to chase anyone. It knows sooner or later, you'll come to it.